All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Tobias McMullen, and this is my fictive culture that I've been working on. So, some background to the world of this culture. There is a Bermuda Triangle effect in place all over the world. So, after years and years and generations of war and bloodshed on Earth, the Earth has become tainted, and now they live in this apocalypse era. The internet doesn't function like it used to, and a couple of civilizations just seem to have gone missing off the face of the earth. Where the Bruit Mort are settled used to be known as Niagara Falls, Canada, but the earth has sunken down farther into the ground, and now they are surrounded by the waterfalls instead of living next to it. And they seem to think that over the course of years and years, ever since this has happened, it only seems like the waterfalls are getting bigger, as if they're growing, and now they've become a huge physical barrier around this city. So, the Bruit Mort, they are a mime society, and they're essentially just anthropologists who are trying to grieve humanity and trying to record what's left of it and look back at what kind of recordings they already have and conserve those. So the reason they don't speak, or rarely speak, that is not only because they are in a permanent state of grieving, but these new waterfalls that keep growing and getting bigger have generated so much noise pollution that you can't really hear anyone else anyway, especially when you're outside. And so this is kind of the first important figure of this fictive culture. His name is Matthias Busquet. He's the prime minister of Bruit Mort, and he's a descendant of Nikola Tesla, who in 1895 once built a hydroelectric power plant, the first hydroelectric power plant over in Niagara Falls, which is now Bruit Mort. So he lives in the power plant. It's kind of his HQ. It's kind of almost like the capital of the entire city-state. And his home is the largest library in the entirety of Bruit Mort. He has a lot of documents that they've saved, and he watches over them personally. But he does host a open to the public museum of Bruit Mort culture and dedication to his ancestor Nikola Tesla. So there's also a lot of that there, and he's generally well liked by his citizens. So 4 common laws you'll see in Bruit Mort that are pretty heavily enacted on are, firstly, no verbal communication in public spaces outside of designated holidays or specified hours, which is most of the time. The waterfalls that surround Bruit Mort are protected by the government. Dumping, polluting, or constructing around them without permission can mean jail time or huge hefty fines. So burning, defacing, or otherwise destroying literature may be punishable by death. The Bruit Mort are very serious about preserving human history, and literature is one of the most highly regarded forms of, let's say, fossil or artifact. And to obtain citizenship, one must be proficient at least 3 languages, so 3 different languages, and they instill this through their school system. So because there's no more migration happening with the kind of end of the world and the physical barriers and the Bermuda Triangle effect, everyone is either born or dies in Bruit Mort culture, so they all kind of go to school in the same place, and that's how they learn those languages for sure to get that citizenship. Some of their shared morals would be dignity and reason is something they boast. All disputes can be settled in writing or through the court system. Nothing is more effective than communal discussion and deliberation. If you've raised your voice, you've lost. And Bruit Mort is nearly entirely agnostic. Freedom of religion still exists and is still protected by law, but loyalty to a specific denomination of religion is seen as like a failure to pursue greater enlightenment. The Bruit Mort like to be very kind of vague and loose with their commitments to things. They're not very strong in identity either which way. You'll come to see as we talk about race and sexuality and gender. They like to be very ambiguous people. And silence is power. Abstinence from speech is the utmost sign of respect to the lost world, which is what they call the old world before the apocalypse. And testament to silence is a readiness to transcend humanness into something more. So they believe that by forsaking language and trying to cut that out, that they can brace themselves to become more than human. And some norms in Bruit Mort would be when you hear music on the radio, concerts are purely instrumental, and so is basically all the music you're going to hear. But in the rare instances where Bruit Mort artists use their voice, they sing in gibberish, actually. There's no defined language to kind of avoid, once again, being specific to anything or showing a kind of loyalty to anything or any background in particular. So their work days, school days, business operations, and social events only really happen between 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's essentially their entire day as communal effort to conserve hydroelectric power. Since that's all they really have to keep the city-state going. And just generally, it's the apocalypse, so things are a lot gloomier, there's a lot less sunshine, so the days get dark, essentially, by 2 p.m., so everyone really stays inside afterwards. And donning of mime-like makeup once citizenship is earned, the Bruit Mort call it their family face, as the design kind of runs through family lines and is passed on once you become a certified adult and a certified citizen. So an example of a deviant subculture in the Bruit Mort culture would be the Preachers. They are a doomsday cult, and they've been exiled from Bruit Mort for their excessive fear-mongering and disturbance of the peace. So what they do is they plant speaker systems around populated areas of Bruit Mort and broadcast deafeningly loud messages calling for the end of times and sacrifices to the waterfalls, particularly human sacrifices. And that kind of just immediately explains the taboos that they're breaking here. So proselytizing in public spaces, using their voices, and generating what would be regarded as obscene sound. And also advocating for human sacrifice. That is definitely taboo in the Bruit Mort culture as it is in others. So the most important ritual in Bruit Mort culture is most definitely the donning of the family face, which I explained in the last slide. The family face is the mime makeup that they put on after they become a citizen, and that gets passed, the design gets passed through generations of family. So the youth of Bruit Mort are rigorously taught a mixture of languages from the ages of 5 to 18. Then upon their 18th birthday, they're summoned to the Bruit Mort City Ceremonial Hall, where they give a retelling of their family tree, spanning back from their generation back to their great-great-grandparents. They have to do this in 3 different languages successfully, or the retelling will be halted. And the details of the retelling must include things like names, birth dates, birth locations, professions, and at least one anecdote related to each family member. If an individual fails the passage, they'll only be allowed to retry once a year until they're 21. And after 21, if they once again cannot pass the ritual, they will be denied their family face, they'll be socially ostracized as a degenerate, and this results in them possibly getting scrubbed from their family tree and just kind of rejected from the family. They won't be allowed to don the family face, and they probably won't be able to finalize citizenship. So, but those who pass will begin wearing their family's signature face paint style every day for the rest of their lives. They have a choice of inheriting their mother's or father's style of face paint. And graduation from youth to a respected adult member of society, and you get officiated acceptance into your own family. So here I did a little sample of a fake Bruit Mort passport. They don't really need full-blown passports as they once did in the old world, because travel isn't very possible anymore, but nonetheless they keep them around for identification, and I guess this is what it would look like once you finish that ritual. You get your official citizenship, and you put your family face on for the first time. So this is an example of their language. Obviously, they very rarely speak it aloud because they are nonverbal, but this is what they would write in, along with the other 3 languages they likely learned while in school. Some rules of grammar in this language are there are no personal pronouns. Every member of Bruit Mort society is exclusively referred to by their name, including when they speak in third person. And unidentified and plural groups are referred to as O. That's like they're they. Until a name is found or given. Youth are taught not to write in capital letters until age 16 to distinguish a child's voice from an adult voice in writing. So their kinship system works a lot like the Sudanese kinship system. They trace their lineages bilaterally, and they are very thorough with their kinship system because they have a great collective fear of being forgotten, especially in this unpredictable apocalypse world. So they try to pay tribute, and they give every member of the family a particular title or ascribe them like a hyper-specific name. And due to their isolation from all previously known societies, the Bruit Mort can essentially only be endogamous. However, exogamy between smaller subcultures within the Bruit Mort is encouraged to ensure that culture exchange is still woven into the practices of their relatively small society. They're an anthropological, a society. They all want to be anthropologists, so to ensure that more culture is created and continued in the small time that they have left until whenever the apocalypse really ends, they still try to encourage that. And so, with the grueling task of trying to document as much of what Bruit Mort life and culture remains, relying on complex kinship systems makes polygamy or, polygyny or polyandry heavily frowned upon. So they consider it to be excessive, and monogamy is held as responsible because you're keeping that family tree kind of tighter, keeping track of the branches better. And so dowry and bride wealth don't exist. They do not marry for finances or anything like that, not for honor. They marry for love. But most marriages are expected to exchange thoughtfully made family photo books, as once again, the Bruit Mort find it very important to know their own history and know the history of the world. So it's a good token of appreciation when families exchange that during marriages. Divorce is permitted, but only once, and there's no possibility of remarriage. It's essentially considered polygamy to get remarried. So once again, they don't want family trees getting unruly and untraceable. So you are only allowed one marriage in your lifetime. Premarital sex is not innately frowned upon, but reproducing out of wedlock is extremely taboo. The child will be barred from inheriting either family's family face because it has put the honor and validity of their family tree at stake. Same-sex marriages are not taboo nor prohibited, but adoption is far more complex for same-sex parents. They need to prove extensively that they know the child's biological family tree so they can integrate it into their own family tree. And then the Bruit Mort, as mentioned, marry for love and arranged marriage. So in regards to gender in Bruit Mort society, their quote-unquote accepted gender categories include male, female, bigender, so like an even 50-50 split of androgyny, and a spectrum of everything in between from male to female. However, strangely enough and ironically, being without gender or being agender or gender neutral is taboo in their society. So gender expression is considered a highly respected performance art, and a refusal to participate in it is seen as like uncultured and distasteful. The Bruit Mort have this kind of issue with hypocrisy from time to time, where they want to be above labels, but they also end up just reenacting them. So there's not many enforced gender roles that we would consider traditional in our day and age, but they praise themselves a lot for having a mainly androgynous society, so they have a fairly equal spread of gender identities present in workplaces, education, and positions of power. But once again, ironically, hyperfemininity and hypermasculinity are seen as slightly distasteful. I guess they respect it more than being devoid of gender or not participating in gender, but they don't seem to. They're a little snobby about their performances, and hyperfemininity, hypermasculinity, being too heavy on one end of the spectrum is looked down upon, socially at least. And they aspire for something called balanced androgyny. It's held in high regard and seen as very human, artistic, and well-rounded. Intersex people are accepted in society just as readily as the cisgender counterparts, with no sex-based discrimination so long as they engage with the performance of gender. Though, strangely, within like the intersex community, individuals with a high physical androgyny receive privilege in society more so than other intersex individuals with more acute intersex traits. Same-sex marriage is not prohibited nor discriminated against. Repopulation is actually an extremely low priority for the nihilistic Bruit Mort. Marriage for love over procreation is highly regarded. They strive to be transhuman, defying prior assumptions that humans are predominantly biological machines for survival. Transgenderism is completely commonplace in Bruit Mort society. They actually have an overwhelming amount of their population that would fit into the vague transgender umbrella. Nearly a quarter of them identify as some degree of gender fluid. Once again, androgyny is something that's kind of really held in really high regard, and it's seen as classy, and it's the zeitgeist of the time. So, social acceptance of varying gender expressions and relaxed gender roles negates the demand for physical transition, actually. So, now that I guess androgyny and gender ambiguity is more socially accepted in their society, not many people go for sex reassignment surgeries anymore. So, that's just how it kind of works within their society, and people have much more fluid presentations in the Bruit Mort. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Bruit Mort are generally a very agnostic society. Not many of them commit themselves to a particular religion, and those who do commit themselves to a particular denomination of religion are kind of looked down upon socially. But the most popular religion that persists is widowism. So their creation story is much like the Christians. They believe that God made the earth in 7 days and that his existence predated creation itself and the entire universe. But what Widowists believe is that on the seventh day, God created man and then finished building the earth to encase himself inside of it and die. So the Widowists are a very, very nihilistic group, and they believe that the apocalypse was triggered by the amount of human bloodshed on the earth seeping to the core where God's resting place is and tainting it, unfortunately. So they believe that the apocalypse was brought on by human sin. And but when it comes to their ideas of the afterlife, they believe that heaven is a kind of akin to a lavish casino filled with different tiers of pleasure, and suffering on earth would be the currency. So they have this idea that the more you suffer, the more points you kind of get, not literal points, but like karmic points you get in the afterlife, and you'll be treated better in heaven than you were on earth. So the more you suffer, the better it gets when you die. And they even hope to be rewarded with the option of reincarnation if their life was so bad this time around. And they often forsake wealth and their worldly pleasures in hopes of ascending to the most elite level of the afterlife. So a lot of them deprive themselves of, common pleasures and joys. Maybe they participate in, fastings for a really long time to try and climb this ladder of suffering. So, how they think they achieve salvation is prefaced by a masochistic week-long ritual, which is more akin to exposure therapy than anything religious. So they hope to achieve salvation by exposing themselves to triggers, trying to induce repeat panic attacks and episodes of crying or hysteria in order to achieve a euphoria or a catharsis that will come afterwards. And it's said that when they hit that point where all the pain lapses into catharsis, that is what salvation is. Their acts of devotion are unfortunately very self-destructive. Self-injury and, starvation, deprivation of needs to kind of testify to their suffering. Some of them will drastically alter their appearance to bring humiliation upon themselves. And when they go to church, in their churches, they do a communal grieving session. So a lot of their devotion is centered around grieving the dead God and grieving all of their suffering on earth. So everyone present at the church would be expected to cry for the dead God, and those who mourn harder or louder or more expressively are considered more devout. So the more upset you are, essentially, the more devoted you look. So their only deity is God, which is essentially the Christian Catholic God, but strangely enough, they don't believe in Jesus. So instead, they believe any man has the potential to become a Christ figure through a unique and immense set of trials of suffering. So if you're like the Hercules of suffering, then you might end up being the Jesus figure of Buddhism. So they believe that Jesus hasn't come yet, or hasn't even been born yet, that we haven't gotten to that point as early as it is described in the Christian Bible. And the prematurely started apocalypse might mean there might never be a Christ. So with the apocalypse going on, they think that they lost their chance at a savior, and so on and so forth with their nihilistic views. So for practitioners, each church has a pastor who delivers the sermons and organizes the matters of the church, but there's only one position above him, which is called the director of mourning. So the pastor is looked at for casual advice and more community advice about local projects and stuff, The director of mourning works as almost like an anti-therapist. So the director of mourning is always going to get this impression that they're a really genuine person, really warm and really friendly with all the members of the church. But really what they want to do is encourage self-sabotage, and they often manipulate these targeted individuals, those who look the most vulnerable, to get money out of them to fund the church. So the way widowists explain human suffering is that it is entirely self-imposed, and they do believe that humans are innately evil. Though widowists believe that we were all created on the seventh day, the same day that God died, they think on the sixth day that Adam and Eve were created as prototypes. So we do have that same original sin that is described in Catholicism. But do recall they do not believe in Jesus Christ, so they don't think that sin was removed. And they also believe that the apocalypse has prevented Jesus' birth, so it will never be removed. They do not believe in evil spirits. They just believe that hell is entirely human populated and it exists unregulated by any Satan-like figures. So they don't even believe in the devil or Satan. They just believe it's perpetuated by humans and will continue to be. Okay, so modes of production, exchange, and labor. That would be industrial agriculture, pastoralism, and redistribution. So the Bruit Mort live on an augmented earth because of the effects of the apocalypse. It's essentially tainted land. A lot of textures and dimensions of substances are unpredictable and will change on a whim, such as soil, mud, rock, and water. Like what one day might be a field of soft soil may next be diamond hard. Still standing water may become gelatinous at random and unusable for this reason. So both horticulture and agriculture are no longer possible the way they once were. Instead, the Bruit Mort use their intensive knowledge of science and technology to genetically modify or clone vegetation. So they have a seed vault, actually, which exists somewhere in Bruit Mort, where seeds from the old world, or the pre-apocalyptic world, are stored, cataloged, and highly guarded. So some small warehouses exist dedicated to an industrialized form of pastoralism, but their existences are cruel and deeply inhumane. Meat is absent from the diet of most Bruit Mort due to its highly expensive and controversial production. These animals, such as cows and chickens, are fed genetically modified seeds, and the overall quality of meat products has substantially degraded. So redistribution, oh my god. So redistribution as an exchange system in Bruit Mort was inspired actually by Matthias Bousquet, the prime minister who we met earlier in the presentation. The government places heavy emphasis on redistribution. Members of Bruit Mort having such distinct, thoroughly researched family trees and many individual... So redistribution as an exchange system in Bruit Mort was actually inspired by Matthias Bousquet, the prime minister of Bruit Mort, who we met earlier in this presentation. His open house generosity and just welcoming people in has encouraged a lot of the wealthier members of Bruit Mort society to redistribute their wealth in conjunction with the government. So the government places a heavy emphasis on redistribution. A lot of members of Bruit Mort society have such distinct, thoroughly researched family trees, which many of individuals have found themselves uncovering lost family fortunes and generational wealth they didn't know they used to have. So in those higher brackets of generational wealth, they are required by law to pay higher taxes and a hefty inheritance tax, which strictly goes towards state welfare to be oh my god. The use of redistribution as an exchange system in the Bruit Mort was actually inspired by Matthias Bousquet, the prime minister who we met earlier in the presentation. It comes from his open house generosity and him kind of sharing his resources and his generational wealth with the people. So the government places a heavy emphasis on redistribution. Since a lot of Bruit Mort spent their time building their family trees and really researching their history, a lot of them have found lost family fortunes and generational wealth they didn't know they had. And so those who find themselves in the higher bracket of generational wealth are required by law to pay higher taxes and a hefty inheritance tax. But this strictly goes towards the state welfare system and is redistributed to those without such support systems, like those without wealthy family ties. So many of the wealthiest members of Bruit Mort often find themselves to be the loneliest. They usually come from lineages which prioritize pride and legacy rather than connection and affection. So, for this reason, often they follow in the steps of the prime minister and open up their homes during lunch and dinner hours with extra plates of food at their dinner tables so that any struggling members of society can seek support and respite there. So thankfully, the system of redistribution leaves even the most destitute with some access to welfare. Also, considering immigration is no longer possible in the isolated world of Bruit Mort, outside of birth and death, there's little variation in population, so the government is more aptly able to calculate for and accommodate for the portion of the population left under the poverty line. And in a similar vein to Fordism, actually, Prime Minister Bousquet personally offers stable hourly rate job positions to those in lower income brackets. These jobs may range from lower skilled labor, like working in or maintaining the museum he runs out of his home, to opportunities for higher skilled jobs in education in the Bruit Mort, like hydroelectric production and development departments. There's many abandoned and unused buildings which were once needed for a larger population that got converted into temporary social housing as well for those who are faced with homelessness or can't provide for themselves. When it comes to the division of labor, labor is assigned solely to adults. Considering how hard and intensive education is for the youth, they are discouraged from spending their time on jobs and encouraged to just stay in school and focus, especially because they have so many languages to learn. So, a part of the prime minister's plan to prioritize getting the poorest in society into jobs is sponsorship. So the Prime Minister Bousquet places very heavy emphasis on prioritizing getting the poorest in society into jobs. Him, along with some of the Bruit Mort's wealthiest, all contribute voluntarily to sponsorship programs so that impoverished adults can return to education, so long as they promise to specialize in a field that benefits the government's priorities, which would particularly be hydroelectric power and genetics for the purpose of industrial agriculture. Regarding race and racism in Bruit Mort society, the concept of race from the old world still lingers in Bruit Mort somewhat, but it's their shared nationality of being Bruit Mort that takes a much higher priority than the classification of race. I've mentioned it a few times, but immigration nor emigration are possible in the wake of the apocalypse, so they have a tighter unity and care far less for enforcing ideas of superiority or inferiority based on race or ethnicity. They instead like to focus neutrally on studying geographic ancestry only for the sake of cataloging human history. So, as mentioned, they are a society of anthropologists, so they do want to document things and follow lineages and bloodlines, but it is not particular to upkeeping any lineages of hierarchy, like there's no monarchy or anything like that. Both hate speech and hate crimes are dealt with by law in Bruit Mort. In some cases, those who are condemned for race-based hate speech are put through a period of probation, where they're required to conduct a detailed ethnography of the group they attacked, and the offender will not be readily accepted back into Bruit Mort society until satisfactory growth and understanding has taken place. In the cases of Old World literature, which still perpetuates harmful ideas such as white supremacy, it is kept under very tight surveillance, likely in the capital in the Prime Minister Bousquet's home, the Giant Library, and it's only permitted to be read by scholars or those over the age of 18 with specific clearance to do so. The reason has to be related to academics, and it takes a lot of approval to get to that point. It's actually very hard to prove that you need to access that literature. Racist ideologies are often associated with low emotional and overall intelligence. You're usually socially ostracized, and sometimes an offending individual, group, or establishment is deplatformed and blacklisted from educational spaces and most workplaces. Touching on immigration, military, police, and prisons in Bruit Mort, it's come up several times at this point that immigration or emigration is not possible with the state of the world around Bruit Mort, and especially with the giant physical barriers of the waterfalls. The Bermuda Triangle effect disabled any form of travel beyond city-sized perimeters. Ideally, they would happily accept immigrants due to their dwindling population, fear of narrowing gene pool, and collective social fear of being the last society alive on Earth, but that's not their option. The Bruit Mort wait very, very anxiously for contact from any other societies, so any kind of friend would be a friend at that point. The military of Bruitmore has disbanded until evidence of other surviving societies have arisen. They don't feel any need to upkeep the military, and it's a great expense. And when there's no foreign relations, well, they decided to disband. There's a small police force within Bruitmore, but there's a heavy incorporation of social workers and mental health specialists within the system. Vigilante is frowned upon, but blocks of neighborhoods often form their own systems of mutual care and protection and only really work with the police when they feel they can't handle an issue as a community. There are no prisons, no large prisons, nor private prisons in Bruitmore, though there are still smaller scale jails, but they are hybridized with rehab centers in an attempt to prevent reoffense, with the rehabilitation process beginning after conviction. The longest sentence, which can be served, is 4 years, but readmittance is unlimited for minor crimes. For more severe crimes, a death sentence may be delivered via setting the convicted adrift towards the violent waterfalls, which leaves no chance for survival. So Mort exists as a state, but considers itself to be a city-state hybrid. The elderly citizens of Mort still consider themselves to be partially Canadian, but the memory of Mort's past association to the country fades with every generation. The position of mayor has evolved into prime minister, which is now Prime Minister Bousquet. And during the beginning of the apocalypse, the government body of Mort feared its citizens would descend into anomie and anarchy from the sudden removal of an overarching centralized government. So they kind of kept this feeling of a larger government, even though everything in their world has shrunken down. The city of Mort became its own state, and the downsize also led to neighborhoods and clusters of blocks adopting new names as if to mimic the function of small towns. So everyone's kind of in denial about how small their world has got, so they have adjusted and made Mort both a city and a state. So when it comes to their traditional art, upon the passing of a relative, the Mort fashioned theater masks out of ceramic, which they paint with the family face, and then they deliberately crack it with a small hammer, and then fill those cracks with a mixture of resin and the blood of the deceased. Then they flip the mask over, and on the back of it, they etch the name of the deceased into it, along with their birth and death date, and then this is passed on to their next of kin as a family heirloom. Well, thank you very much for visiting my fictive culture, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much. Farewell.